All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We are continuing our series, Success Leaves Clues. We're specifically looking at past presidents as an example of people of high degrees of success and the things that made them successful. In specific, the presidents that have left a long legacy. Throughout their lives and through their presidential terms, what attributes, what skills did they have to make them successful? Kind of digging into that and understanding what makes for successful people. We're doing that with Dr. Roger Hall, who I'll bring on momentarily here. But specifically with Abraham Lincoln, we're going to be talking about, in somewhat in order, adversity, communication skills, and then his, conviction or perseverance with his efforts. With that, I'll bring in Dr. Hall. He's a business psychologist, executive coach, multi-time author, a public speaker, and my favorite aspect is the neuro nerd side of him, is in how it is that we implement the things that he teaches us on. With that, I'll bring him on, and I'm super excited about this episode because I don't know. I personally, in my research, don't know I don't know if the word's a more iconic figure, a presidential figure ever. Uh, what's your take on that? You're much more of a historian than I am, but he seems to be the most iconic in my opinion.
Well, I think Washington formed the nation and formed the Union, and Lincoln preserved the Union. And I think there are good consequences to having a United States. Um, his critics, and the obvious is everybody says he freed the slaves, which is maybe a little more nuanced than just out and out, you know, freeing the slaves, because the Emancipation Proclamation was essentially saying, if we capture Confederate property like
Mm-hmm.
donkeys and slaves, we can put them to our own use,
Mm,
which doesn't exactly sound like freedom.
yeah.
Later on, it was solidified, and the slaves were freed. Um, but um, his critics would say he created an incredible expansion of centralized power,
Mm,
that the power shifted from the states to the central government. And that's precisely what the Confederacy was against. Um, the difficulty of having a confederacy is that the United States had a confederacy. I don't know if you knew this or not.
mm,
After the independence from England, from the end of the war until I believe it was 1787, it was the Confederacy of the United States,
mm.
and we had a different actually had a different president
Interesting.
of the Confederacy, and they just couldn't hold it together.
Mm,
Confederacies tend to be so loosely aligned with different interests that there's not enough centralized power to keep it going. Um, and so there's always a tension between state power and centralized power. And Lincoln's critics would say that he overly centralized power
huh.
in Washington.
Interesting. Well, there's certainly a lot there, and the tumultuous time that we had as a country, and
Yeah,
where he was at. So all great stuff, and I'm super excited to dig into it. Let me just do a couple of real small housekeeping
sure.
items here, and we'll jump into the meat. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Jared Lee. I'm the associate broker and team lead here at My Home Connection, also known as MHC Realty. Our sponsor is the Perfect Real Estate Business, in which, in large part, we share this with Dr. Hall, introducing business coaching, life coaching, mentoring, and training, and then the other things that you would want out of a real estate team. If you have any questions and would like to have that conversation, we'd love to jump on a call with you. But with that, let's jump into the meat in regards to kind of the the common theme that we've had in some of our past episodes. Success leaves clues. Adversity seems to be a common one. And I think,
Yes.
if you're going to accomplish big things, you have to overcome big things. Fair?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you want to if you want to be able to lift heavy objects, you have to practice lifting heavy objects. And to be successful requires that you have learned certain skills, and the teacher of that is adversity or suffering.
What's interesting about him is he was pretty obviously and vocal about the state of his mindset at some points. I mean, he really seemed to get into the doldrums on a couple of these things, right? He lost, his first love, fiance, multiple children, a sister who he was super close to. I mean, on and on and on.
Well, it started out with his mother, who he never knew.
Yeah.
And he was raised by his stepmother.
Yeah, which was a godsend from what it sounds like. And maybe
his stepmother made him into who he was. Yes.
Yeah. But there was definitely times in his writings and even what people would see in him. I don't know if it was like a melancholy or a
Sure.
Just a state of calmness. But there was always this underlying, maybe not peace, but like compassion for others. So he clearly decided to be better than bitter.
Yeah. He certainly suffered, and I think the word you used, melancholy, was used to describe him. He was a very somber and sometimes sad person, probably relatively introverted, and in many ways overwrought by the suffering that he had. So if we counted up, his mom died before he knew her. He was raised by his stepmom, who was fundamentally central to his life. She died. His sister died. Anne Rutledge, the love of his life, died. I think 2 of his kids died. This to a relatively young man, and he came from nothing. I have been to visit the cabin where he was born, and it's really awful.
A shack.
It was a shack, and then the cabin where he was raised, I've also visited, which was he went from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois. So I've been to the Kentucky and the Illinois cabins, and they're just they're hovels. There wasn't anything to them. They were barely shelters from the storm.
Yeah, and his activities around the what do we call it? Like the removal of the trees and the foliage and stuff like that on the farm, from what it sounds like, was pretty brutal. And so he hated kind of the farm, and his out or his exit was reading, self-taught, as I understand it, correct?
Yeah. They would actually ship books in barrels, and he would go down and get a barrel of books. He couldn't afford the whole barrel, but he would go sample from a barrel of books. And it was a time, for those of you who are environmentalists, that in Indiana, in Illinois, and Ohio, they were largely covered with forests. If you go visit them now, they're largely cropland, and all of that forest was cut down by hand and burned. So you've got these old growth forests that were cut down, and people like Abraham Lincoln with axes and saws cut it down. Yeah. So if you wanted to farm land, you had to cut down a 500-year-old, oak tree, or these enormous old trees, fell it, chop it up, and then you'd have to burn and chop out the root before you could ever use the soil. So it's incredibly labor intensive.
Yeah. Lots there. The quote that I put in here, because it kind of seemed to share his mindset. It was such that, and I'll just read it. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. Like, this he's like, I'm at the point where I'd rather be dead, or things have got to improve.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, in our first world life, if you think about life in the early 1800s in the Midwest, which was at the time considered to be the Western frontier, and it really was the frontier in the 18, well, let's see, he would have been probably 1830s when he was coming of age, 1840s. It really was like a third world country to us today in our first world. You know, they didn't have running water. They had no electricity. You read by oil lamp. You were lucky if you got candles. Again, you got taught how to read by someone who already knew how to read, and that's the skill that changed your life. And so you're looking at abject poverty in hovel conditions with low literacy rates, and then you get this man who comes out of it who is a really superlative person and changed the course of American and world history.
Yeah, he was not going to school. He was cutting down trees, and he said,
"Yeah,
I want to discontinue cutting down trees. So what am I going to do?" So here's a guy decides, not only am I going to read, but eventually become an attorney, and eventually become a senator, and then eventually beyond that become the president of the United States. Bringing the union. I mean, it's just bringing the union together. It's just an amazing story.
Yeah, and it's an amazing story, and not all of it, frankly, is he lost a lot of elections, but Mary Todd, his wife, was a climber. She was looking for the next. Right? Pardon?
Aristocrat family.
She came from a wealthy family, and she actually dated Stephen Douglas, who was the person he debated to become president. And so she had her hooks into one. She was going to rise to the top. She was going to make it. And so whose wagon was she going to hook herself to? And then when she hooked herself to Lincoln's wagon, she was the kind of person who was behind the scenes saying, "You better get to that. You better do that." Right. So she really understood how to work the system to get him a position of power. When he went into the convention where he was nominated for president, nobody knew who he was, but he campaigned on the floor. The nomination system then was different than it is now, where we have primaries. It was at the convention when people would throw their hat in the ring, and they would be chosen after multiple rounds of voting. And he did all sorts of things, including some trickery. Like, he would print up fake tickets to get into the event so people could vote for him. So there was all sorts of conniving done, and I'm of the mind that he's certainly complicit, but Mary Todd Lincoln was behind much of that because she was a climber. She wanted power and prestige and wealth.
Well, she must have saw the potential in him of the next topic, which is communication. She must have clearly saw that he kind of mesmerized, his audience, that he was a very capable man. As I understand it, she actually, I don't know if she turned him down on his first proposal or if the family, kind of poo-pooed it, or a combination of both, but, it took like another year to go back at it. So I'm a
little fuzzy on that, but he really wasn't of her caliber.
Yeah.
And, she was wealthy, and he was a circuit riding attorney. So he and the opposing counsel would stagecoach from town to town to town, and they would then argue against each other during the day on these cases.
He's traveling around the state.
He's traveling the circuit in Illinois. And so he really didn't have that much going for them, except a great intellect and a very good way of communicating. Before we move to communication, I want to come back to adversity. In the White House, Mary Todd Lincoln came unglued when their son Tad, was it Tad? I think it was Tad that died. She she became unglued. And there's a famous quote that in the day, Lincoln worked to keep the Union together, and every night he'd walk upstairs and try to keep Mary Todd together.
Wow.
She was really falling apart. If you do, a psychological autopsy, she probably had the hoarding version of obsessive compulsive disorder. So she used their newfound prestige and wealth to gather lots and lots of fancy trinkets. So she just filled their house with, rich junk, handbags and purses and shoes and it would make Imelda Marcos look like, she was just a starter. And if you don't know who Imelda Marcos was, she was the first lady of the Philippines and reportedly had 3,000 pairs of shoes. Mary Todd Lincoln didn't have 3,000 pairs of shoes, but she was of that same variety of person.
Yeah.
And when her son died, when the last son who died, she just came completely unglued, and Lincoln had to put her together.
I can't imagine. I mean, we talked about all this adversity, prior to becoming a president, but now you've got, you're newly elected as the president. You've already got states within the union that are succeeding the union. They're just falling off like flies.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then
and he had to sneak into Washington because there were plots to kill him.
Yeah. And now he's not only taking care of the country, but he's taking care of his wife. He's lost yet another child, and now his wife is kind of going off the deep end. Like, holy mackerel!
Yeah.
That's a nervous laugh. I don't mean to laugh, but wow,
it was awful. It was awful, and the first, I think, 3 or 4 generals he had were awful. They couldn't get it done. It wasn't until he got Grant from the Western campaign to take over the armies, but all of his generals were they were playing war. They would drill and they would march and they would march and they would drill, but they never actually got anything done. And it took a long time until he got Grant in that first chair before things started turning around, because they were really incompetent.
Well, I think he had massive hope in Robert E. Lee for the longest time, and then they succeeded the union. He lost him too, right? So the one person that he thought he had.
I mean that Lee is a complicated story. He loved his country, but he thought, I have to fight for my brothers in my state.
Yeah.
So he's been widely vilified because he fought for the Confederacy, and until the last few years, I think there was a greater understanding of what happened to our country and the brotherhood that thrived after the war, recognizing the toll that it took on our country, and forgiveness that was there, which in recent years has certainly not been there.
Yeah. 1 million lives lost. I don't know what our population was at that time, but it had to be a very significant percentage.
Oh, huge percentage. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was per capita the most costly war we've ever had. Yeah. By far. No question, by far.
Yeah. So adversity, right? If you're going to do big things, you've got to overcome big things. Clearly, Lincoln has an ability to overcome things and move things forward. But what's his overarching talent through all this is his communication style. Can you give us some insight into kind of how he, used that ability to bring the Union?
He was an incredible storyteller. I mean, the Gettysburg Address is his most famous speech.
After losing 50,000 people.
I think in that day, there were 40,000 casualties, and casualties includes deaths and injuries. I think the death toll that day was about, if I'm remembering right, are in the neighborhood of 10,000. But both sides had these caravans of ox carts and horse cars carrying wounded people, away. And in those areas, if you got a gunshot wound in an arm or a leg, they amputated. So there's so many people lost lives and so many people lost limbs. in one day. And if I'm remembering that right, I think that the death total in Vietnam was 40,000, and we lost, in terms of death, a quarter of that in a single day in Gettysburg. So it was an incredibly costly battle, and and he was looking to create peace, but it wasn't just his way with speeches. He had debates, and this was an era where public debates were very common. And Stephen Polk was his opponent, and they would have 3-hour debates, unmicrophoned, in front of huge crowds of people, and reporters would report on what was happening in the debate, and people listened to these 3-hour debates. And it just, unlike our current setup where you have an hour and these tightly defined rules, these were debates, and they happened over and over and over again, because there's no way to broadcast it. So they get on trains and they go from town to town to town and keep having these debates. And then the newspaper people would write up the summaries and disseminate it, and people read it. So you had to be really good on your feet. He was an incredibly smart person, well-read. He had a great grasp of ancient literature. He would sprinkle in his anecdotes stuff from great literature and the Bible. So he was incredibly well-read and had a really great mind. But he's also a great storyteller. People when he was in a relaxed frame of mind, he would just tell these hilarious stories. Some of them a little naughty. But people loved to be around him. So here you have this contrast, this man of sorrow and melancholy. But when you got him by himself, he would tell these hilarious stories. So he was very smart and really cared about other people in terms of lightening their mood.
Interesting.
And if we look at leaders work on that. And human beings remember things by stories. Our lives are narratives. And so we remember things as a narrative. We very rarely retain facts, as is probably obvious from my inability to retain the exact numbers of casualties in Gettysburg. But we do remember the stories. And he was incredibly good at captivating people's attention by telling them stories. So if you want to be a great leader, that's something to work on, your ability to tell a story with a beginning, middle, end, and a lesson.
Yeah, that's super important to know in becoming a leader. How do you bring people together? How do you find an emotional position? I don't know. I imagine there's a lot there, but if you're going to have somebody that's on your side for a particular endeavor or effort, you're building the why, maybe?
Well, I studied persuasion and attitude change as an undergrad and a graduate student. It's been a professional and personal interest of mine in adulthood. And one of the things we're learning is that people, when they decide, are typically not making logical decisions. They're making emotional decisions. And so if you're able to capture their emotions, their hearts, then you can capture their minds. And humor and stories are a great way of capturing people's hearts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you. That's what I was looking for, trying to understand the essence of what his communication style did ultimately to do what we're coming to next. And that is, what is his conviction and where does his wisdom come from? And ultimately to hold the Union together, because it was falling apart,
Yeah, it was falling apart, and there's considerable debate. And I think if you look at his public statements, he's said things like, "If I could preserve the Union by abolishing slavery, I will. If I can preserve the Union without abolishing slavery, I would." So so he 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 is rightly um, responsible for the abolition of slavery in the United States, but that wasn't his motivation. That was a means to a different end. It's a wonderful means, um, a, a the end of slavery is a wonderful end. But I'm not sure it would be fair to say that was his primary motivation. It was far more complicated than that. Certainly, he didn't view the slaves as subhuman, unlike some of his contemporaries. But he nor was he somehow an abolitionist.
Well, I guess he's famous for the House divided, so he clearly knew that he had to fix that, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and what you're referring to is his famous quote is "A house divided cannot stand," which is a quote from the Bible. And if you look at the quote in the Bible, it's people attributing to Jesus casting out demons by the devil, and Jesus answers back, essentially that doesn't make any sense. If the devil is casting out its own demons, that's a divided house, and a divided house cannot stand. And so Lincoln, I think, aptly applied that to the United States, that a divided house cannot stand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, how much credit do you think you would give Abraham Lincoln in his sole efforts, like of what you know of that time, and ultimately getting through the Civil War? I don't know that I've heard many people getting major contributions towards the outcome. I mean, it seems, I don't know, I'm sure it's not solely based upon his efforts, but largely.
I say largely. I mean, he was steering the ship, and I'll be a little critical here. He did things like he got rid of trial by jury. I don't know if you knew that.
Martial law
during the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had martial law. He stopped habeas corpus, which is trial by jury. So he did a lot of things in a military setting that today our heads would spin. His purpose, though, was to keep the Union together, and I think he's largely responsible for making that happen. He made decisions that made it possible for the North, who was better funded and better populated, to defeat the South, which was led better by Lee. Lee was a better general, with less resources and less people. But it didn't look like that was going to happen until Lincoln made some decisions to change things up. So I think he is responsible for saving the country. And then John Wilkes Booth viewed him as a tyrant. He viewed him as consolidating too much power in the state, and killed him.
In my research, I found that he said to his wife, I wish I could remember the quote, but basically, we are going to be more cheerful every day going forward, the day that he died. And that was the happiest she had ever seen him.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful story, and I hope it's true, that as kind of melancholy or as sorrowful as he was with all the things that were going on, hopefully, and all the experiences he went through, that day was maybe a unique state of mind for him that he rightfully deserved.
Well, I think he did deserve it, and if he had lived, what happened next would have been very different. Back then, the president was from one party and the vice president was from the other party. So Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, and he was a Southern Democrat. And when Lincoln was assassinated, it essentially put someone who was supportive of the South in the first chair. And so we see the rollback of many of of Lincoln's reforms once Andrew Johnson took power, and we believe the bringing together of the nation would have been better, and the treatment of our black citizens would have been better. We don't know this, but you can't argue a counterfactual. But you wonder, if Lincoln had survived, there may not have been Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
That the country may have healed better, and black citizens would not have been subjugated as much. But again, much of his good intention fell apart once he was assassinated.
Yeah. Interesting. What a fascinating life. I mean, from the beginning to the end is just, I don't know. History is amazing, and some of the successful people that we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess the point I want to make about Lincoln is it's easy. We've all heard a lot of myths about Lincoln, some of which were true, but there is this sense that we need to paint him with a broad brush of being superhuman somehow. And I don't think we need to do that in order to have deep respect for him, to see him as a central figure in American history, and a good central figure in American history. But we don't need to. He wasn't superhuman. He was just like us.
Good point.
And that's why these examples, I think, are so valuable, is we can see these deeply flawed human beings do rise to the challenge sometimes and do incredible things when put in a difficult situation, and frankly change the course of Western civilization, and ultimately, whether it was his primary goal or not, freed the slaves and ended slavery in the United States, which was a blessing, and it ended the curse that our country started with, which was, when our country was founded, slavery was already intact in the colonies, and so they had to unwind that practice, and it took a civil war. I mean, we're the only country who fought a war over slavery.
Yeah, no, I think your comment there is very profound, and we need to realize that these people we're talking about are not superhuman, right? The quote that I just read earlier gives you an idea into where his head was at a certain point in his life. There's stories of him, when he originally did ask, I think it was Mary Todd, to marry him, and she turned him down. I think he spent like 3 days in bed. The guy that he was, that was renting to him, it's like, are you gonna be all right? The guy was devastated, but he got over it. So, I mean, to your point, we have these things happen, deal with it and then move on and get back.
And deal with it by grieving. He was grieving. And when Anne Rutledge died, he grieved. If Anne Rutledge had lived, I wonder what our country would be like.
Right.
Would he have ever been president? Or would he have been a happy state representative in Illinois with a wife who adored him?
Yeah, because this was early. She was 22.
Yeah, it was
this
early,
is way early. He hadn't accomplished nearly nothing that he ultimately ended up accomplishing. So who knows? Yeah,
who knows? Who knows?
Interesting. Well, good stuff. Well, let's we're just a little bit past the 30-minute mark, so let's go ahead and wind things down. But let's make sure our audience knows how to get a hold of you and what resources you have.
Yeah, you can reach me at my website at drrogerhall.com, drrogerhall.com. On my website, you can find the links to my books, DIY Brain, Staying Happy, Being Productive, and Expedition. I also have an online course called Freak Out, which if you have fear and you have anxiety, this is a 10-hour course that will teach you how to overcome that fear and live more purposefully. If you'd like to follow me, you can follow me on X or on Instagram at drrogerhall.com, and that's spelled out Dr. DOCTOR, rogerhall.com.
Excellent. Well, Roger, Dr. Hall, thanks again so much for coming on. I just love these topics, and I hope that our I don't know, listeners, watchers, uh, take some excitement around the tools, the skills that you share, and then as we look back in history to show example of people that are successful and the things they went through, creates some optimism in their lives.
Yeah, and I think realizing that these people are just like us, they're not superhuman, uh, gives us hope that we can accomplish great things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, with that, again, thanks, Dr. Hall, and we'll wish everybody a
Thanks
blessed
for
one.
having me.
Take care.